Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Jennifer White. I'm hosting for today's podcast. I'm a therapist with my LCSW. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm very excited about interviewing our guest today, but before we get started, there's a couple things to mention. First, Mormon Mental Health Podcast is sustained only through your donations. It costs a minimum of $5,000 per year just to barely cover the costs. So any donation is helpful, and your donations go directly to sustaining this podcast. You can do this at our website, mormonmentalhealth.org. And there are many other ways that you can support us. You can like our Facebook, you can share links, tell a friend, provide feedback or comments, and recommend topics. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Wendy Christian. Wendy is a psychoanalyst and licensed clinical social worker in New York City, trained in EMDR and trauma-focused therapy. Prior to becoming a mental health professional, she studied American literature at BYU, where she wrote her master's thesis on women in the Book of Mormon. Subsequently, she obtained a master's degree in clinical social work and postgraduate training in marriage and family therapy and in psychoanalysis and religion. Wendy has a private practice in Manhattan and can be contacted through her website, wendychristiantherapy.com. Hi, Wendy. Welcome to Mormon Mental Health.
Hey, Jen. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I'm a multi-generation Mormon, born and raised in Utah, but I've been a New Yorker for nearly 20 years now. Hailing tonight from the coronavirus social isolation island that it is right now. Surviving, not thriving necessarily, but I'm glad to be here, reaching out and having contact with a human being outside my house. So I was a practicing Mormon for over 40 years, and I still have a lot of love and respect for my many friends and family who are still members of the church. But as a woman and a psychotherapist and a mother of 2 daughters, it became increasingly difficult for me over time to reconcile my personal beliefs and values with some of the church's core doctrines and principles. And I came to be a therapist after some difficult life experiences. And since studying psychoanalysis and social work, I've developed a specialty in trauma therapy, including people who are struggling with life inside or outside closed high demand groups or religions.
Thank you for sharing all that.
Do you want me to define what I mean by a high demand religion or group? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would be great.
I'm thinking this might be the time, because I'm going to mention it probably now and again in answering your question. So I thought I'd offer a definition at the outset. So the concept of a high demand religion is it's a religion that is more likely to cause the same faith crisis. And some of the characteristics are that the religion or leaders are the sole source of truth. Members are told that they're God's elect people. The church's theology claims to provide an exclusive path to salvation. and the church's teachings that are defined as high demand tend to provide a high degree of direction in how members are to view the world, how they're to live their life, and even how they're to interact with others. And then finally, a high demand religion espouses a unique knowledge of metaphysical things like the purpose of life, the nature of God, and afterlife and what that entails. So I hope that's helpful to listeners. I know it might be a new phrase.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. It's nice to kind of have that definition. And I think that like just with your experiences and your worldview and the things that you've learned, that there's a lot that you can bring to this, by sharing your perspective. A lot of people might know that they're not alone in this. And I think that's definitely very helpful. And I think that definition, I think of a lot of different churches that might probably be fit in that. Like, this isn't just unique to Mormonism.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's really for, I think, individual members to decide whether or not, they think their religion or, group, like there's also a lot of groups that people can get recruited into that, might have some of these characteristics. So leave it up to people to decide.
Yes, totally. I love that. Yeah, let's empower people to kind of figure out where their own religion is at.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I really wanted to interview with this is because I loved your podcast you did with Gina, Colvin, about enmeshed families and differentiation. I thought that was really helpful. And do you want to kind of maybe briefly review some of the things you talked about?
Yeah, I get that feedback a lot. So thank you. I never tire of hearing it. And a lot of the credit goes to Gina. She's really a brilliant interviewer and podcaster. And I think she's just really smart and lovely and a good friend. So that podcast that you're referencing, it's episodes 170 and 171 of A Thoughtful Faith podcast with Gina Colvin. And the first episode comprises stories of 3 Mormon women who are navigating a faith transition in enmeshed family systems. And part 2 is my interview with Gina, where we discuss how you can work toward differentiating in an enmeshed family and in the LDS Church, which I speak to, how I think it has some aspects of an enmeshed system. And I think this applies to whether or not a person is in or out of the church, because a lot of people born and raised in Mormonism have been raised in this enmeshed type of family system, which is technically a dysfunctional family, but I think all families have dysfunction on some level. So it's just a matter of degrees. Yes. And while I was a practicing member of the church at the time of that interview, maybe some of my personal information might not be true to this day, but I stand by the principles that I discussed. And I think they remain sound despite my transition out of the church.
Yeah. And we'll make sure that we link to that.
Great.
In the description. So yeah. And it's interesting how you mentioned, because I think families can be dysfunctional, whether they're religious or not religious, whether they're Mormon or not Mormon. You know what I mean? Like, these things can certainly happen. Yeah. Can you give us a brief overview of how family systems work?
Yes. And, again, if I can just give a brief disclaimer here at the outset, I just want to really emphasize that, despite my having now transitioned out of the LDS Church, I see a lot of strength and qualities like grit and determination and certain values of Mormonism, like emphasis on the family, honesty, hard work, and skills like emergency preparedness, which is very timely right now.
Yes.
To be profoundly beautiful and pragmatic. And these are principles that I've taken with me as a post or ex-Mormon. And I'm truly grateful for my Mormon heritage and for what growing up in a tight-knit community like that has taught me. I feel like it taught me things like how to show up for people who are in a crisis and how to serve those who are suffering. And, I think there may be no other church that does community better than the Mormons, and how they take care of each other during major life transitions and crises, again, like the one we're having today. And so in the communities that I now interface with, I bring my Mormonism with me, and I hope to teach that to my children, those same values. Just want to say just lots of love for people still, who still practice and believe strongly in the faith.
Thank you for that.
Sure. So you asked about an overview. Yeah. So that if people don't have time to listen to, that the Thoughtful Faith 2-part podcast, I thought I would give some definitions of some basic terms that I think will lay the groundwork for our discussion today. So the first one is a definition or a brief overview of how family systems work. So family systems theory, this is a definition from Murray Bowen Center, his website, that it's a theory of human behavior that views the family as an emotional unit and uses systems thinking to describe the complex interactions in that unit. It's the nature of a family that its members are intensely connected emotionally. And often people feel distant or disconnected from their families, but this is more feeling than fact. This definition goes on to say families so profoundly affect their members' thoughts, feelings, and actions that it often seems as if people are living under the same emotional skin. So in essence, like in a few words, a family system is, it's comprised of different family members, but there's a homeostasis or like certain predictable family dynamics that are kind of unwritten family rules, and people take on certain roles so that the family operates as a whole, even though it has separate parts. It comes from science, this idea of a system.
Yeah.
So does that make sense? Do you think that will?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I think we've all experienced as we kind of like leave our families and we kind of like are changing and becoming independent, like when we go back to see our family, it's so easy to just slip back into those same roles that we had growing up, because it's just how the family works as a system, so.
Exactly. And Murray Bowen, who was the founder of family systems theory, he talked about how we can't even really talk about a family in terms of like individuals, that individuals can't be understood in isolation from one another, but rather as an emotional unit. So the family is considered an emotional unit. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of times, people talk about enmeshed family systems. What does that look like when it's enmeshed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So enmeshment might be a new term to people. It was first originated by Salvador Minuchin, he was a founder of structural family therapy. And essentially, enmeshment looks like lack of boundaries between individual family members. And even further, to describe that a little more specifically, members in that family are undifferentiated from each other, and they're also undifferentiated or not separate from the family system as a whole. So what this looks like is, in their interaction, is codependence or over concern for other people. And this can get in the way of individual family members obtaining autonomy and living out authentic lives overall.
Yeah.
And maybe the most important aspect of enmeshed family system is that parent needs become the primary focus in the family. And this can result in children being expected to play parental roles. And people may have heard the term parentified child or parentified children. And the parentified child often is given, parent responsibilities and adult tasks that are overwhelming for them. And yet, usually it's the oldest child or the most responsible child who is chosen for this role and plays it out. In my work, I've found, and in my personal experience, I've seen that this is often in LDS families. This role tends to be given to the oldest female child. And if there are two girls at the top of the family, but maybe the first one, disavows that role and won't take it on, like that child just is born with like tons of autonomy and refuses to overly care for others and to deny her developmental needs, then the next oldest child or female child will often be given that role. And in large Mormon families, I've often seen multiple parentified children in one family. And of course, this role could be given to and lived out by male children, but I often see female children being overburdened with parental roles.
And that's something I've noticed too. And I'm curious, like, why do you think it is that it's females that are kind of given that?
I think it goes straight to, I'll just say it, the way Mormon families have always been set up, where, men have the public roles and women have the private roles. So men are kind of overburdened with wage earning and, having a career that can sustain a large family. And, in our early Mormon history, that was multiple wives and multiple households. And then the burden of domestic life and child caring, child rearing was primarily laid at the feet of women. And I think, our modern iterations of this look like the Proclamation on the Family, where, church leaders prescribed gender roles to husbands and wives. I mean, this really limited, I think, the way in which parents view their female children. And it may have already been an unconscious inheritance from kind of this toxic masculine and sexist culture. But I think it's gender roles essentially that have really been prescribed and are kind of seen as church doctrine.
Yeah, a lot of maybe the culture that is kind of passed on and the way people are raised. And I just think it's fascinating how much women are often are doing all the unpaid work, or I don't know. Just
and emotional labor.
Yes. Emotional labor, yes, all that.
Invisible often.
Yeah, and I just wanted to just at least briefly bring that up because I feel like not everyone fits in the box. Not everyone can even have children. Not everyone.
That's right.
It's okay. There's nothing wrong if a man isn't earning enough. I feel like everyone, most of us need 2 incomes to make it these days.
That's right.
Yeah.
And some, women have the same needs as men, and women need a public life as well as a private life. And that may include work. It may not. And if a woman has a luxury not to work and to have hobbies, if she doesn't have, a whole litter of children and, no resources, which there's a lot of poverty involved in large families, when there's only one income. But I think it's also important to point out, to your point, that some women don't choose not to be mothers, choose not to marry. And, that is an individual choice and it's a valid choice. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Definitely. I love that. Yes. Now, one thing you mentioned a little bit earlier, you mentioned differentiation. And this is something I definitely talk a lot about. Like, can you kind of define that for us?
Absolutely. So differentiation is the ability to see yourself as a separate human being from the group or the system and act as a distinct, separate human being. And in a mesh family system or a high demand religion, individuals often lack a kind of psychological differentiation. So this may, it may be that someone, moves away from home. So these are like Western, right, civilizations kind of, or Western cultures prescribed ideas of what healthy human development looks like is moving away from the home at some point as a young adult, right? Whether it's before college, during college, after college, or once you get settled, or, some cultures, in New York City, there's so many different rich, family cultures around here. And there's some people who live at home until they have enough money for a down payment on a house. And, that's fine too. But and whatever works for the person is really what's at the heart of this idea. So so on the outside, it might look like, oh, this person is differentiated because they don't live at home. But it may be that psychologically they're still being impacted by the internalized enmeshed family system, and they may be making life choices that are in harmony with what their parents may want for them, or their grandparents, or the church culture may be prescribing for them, or they may feel pressure to conform in order to be accepted by the religion. But really, differentiation looks like individual's best interests. So for them to be able to know those and to feel that they're valid, things like when to get married, whom to marry, whether or not to have children, when to have children, what kind of work to pursue, and how to pursue it. And this goes for men and women and all genders. How to manage one's money, what to do with one's free time, what church to attend if they want to attend a church at all, and ultimately deciding for yourself what you believe to be true and what values and principles you will use to guide your life.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a great definition. It's interesting how there's a lot of people I work with that like are in their 40s and still like their parents have certain expectations of them, of wanting the best for them and wanting them to succeed. But, sometimes it's like that includes having the same opinion, whether it's political or religious, or going to this college at this time, or well-meaning things, but it's like if you don't fit the role, like there's just some, and I think it's kind of an American thing too.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that differentiation doesn't necessitate disconnection. So
Yes.
I'm not advocating that it means cutoffs, or and or just tension, or so that it really is a parent's task to nurture and to support a child's ultimate differentiation from the parent, and the parent's preferences, and the parent's life choices, and the parent's wishes for the child, when it comes to preferences and what their life journey and life path should look like. But it doesn't mean that has, if that goes along with, if a parent is so distressed by that they require enmeshment or else no relationship, then that puts a child in a lot of distress. It can really lead to severe, acute symptoms like, anxiety, depression, and a myriad of other mental illnesses that children need their parents across the lifespan, and children need their parents to support their slow development of autonomy and determining their own identity and what's true for them. And I'm not saying this is easy, and I'm still in the journey as a parent myself, and I'm not saying I always navigate this perfectly. So I want to give a lot of grace and compassion to everyone involved in navigating a differentiation process with their child, or even like a niece or a nephew or godchild or so to speak, or whatever, family members that they've, there was kind of a oneness and a symbiosis at the beginning, and then it's, slowly they need to be separate, and that's painful. There's grieving and loss that goes along with it, and that's okay.
Yes, totally. Just that's all normal and part of the process. Yeah. And this is something I think we always have to continue to work with. But I do think real like connection with people is like, I don't know, for me, like it just means so much when someone will really care about me and love me, even though I have different views and even though I don't think the same as them, and that they're taking that like time to maybe understand where I'm coming from, even though it's not like their what where their worldview. To me, that's real like connection and real intimacy. So yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Just there can be so much unity and diversity, but it's not something we're used to in, systems like, an enmeshed family system or enmeshment in a religious dynamic and group.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And part of this, I think, would be learning to set healthy boundaries. And what advice would you give those, like people to kind of set boundaries?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think before we even talk about setting healthy boundaries, we have to talk about what a lack of boundaries looks like. So we can understand what we're dealing with when we're dealing with an enmeshed system.
Yes.
So there's kind of a hyper focus on togetherness in these kinds of systems, and togetherness above all else. So, again, I want to reiterate, emotional intimacy and connectedness is good. That's what we want to foster that, but an overemphasis on this kind of togetherness and sameness can lead to a codependence, which gets in the way of a person's normal developmental needs, to be able to, think and behave and determine and differently if that's what they determine is what's true or best for them. So in terms of, so it's very challenging in these systems to buck the system and say, for instance, like there may be a family that likes to get together for reunions, which is great, especially when, this day and age when our family members, siblings, and parents, adult children can be spread all over the country or the world at times. So they might want to get together in person every so often. And, an example might be a family who insists on all the adult children with their children, along with the grandparents, being under the same roof for a week or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. That may not work for everyone. It may work for some adult children and their children, because there may be enough sameness and they may have the same, routines, and they may have enough of the same beliefs and lifestyle and values that there's harmony, and there's, it doesn't create a lot of tension or conflict or angst for anybody. But there may be adult children who have different needs, and whose differentiation may look quite different, because you can behave outwardly one way, but you can be very differentiated on the inside. So I don't want to criticize anyone who says, well, I like being under the same roof as my parents, when I'm an adult with children. That's totally fine. If it works for you and you feel like you can ask for your needs to be met and you can speak up and be heard, that's great. But for someone else, they may not feel comfortable. And so particularly in-laws don't always feel comfortable, being under the same roof. So they may say, hey, we want to get together in person, but we want to stay in a hotel, or we want to stay close by in an Airbnb, or can we find an Airbnb property that has a guest house or something like that? That might be a way of navigating boundaries. So essentially boundaries are like being able to say no.
Yeah. Okay, that's exactly what I was just about to say, of it being safe to say no or to have other options, or that it doesn't have to be. I know when I go to these, and I have a great time, like normally with my in-laws, but my schedule is going to look different. And, I'm someone that normally works really late, and so I might look like I'm lazy and sleeping in, but that's okay for me just to have a different schedule. And those differences can be accepted, I think.
Right.
But yeah.
That's absolutely right. So ultimately, saying no I have the 4 no's that I talk about with boundaries. So you can think no,
Mm-hmm.
you can feel no, you can do no. So you can behave in ways that act out no without saying it. And then finally, you could say no and verbalize it. So thinking and feeling no are inner boundaries. And you really can be differentiated and utilize boundaries and not even say anything, not do anything. And you know that what you think and feel, if it's not safe to say it in that context, you can feel separate within yourself, and that can lower a lot of anxiety and bring a lot of peace. And same thing with feeling. You may not be able to make sense, of what's going on, but you can settle in yourself and breathe into the fact that you are feeling like there's a no, like there's something that feels unsafe or wrong or doesn't jive with you. And you can just really just hold that feeling inside and don't have to do anything about it. But sometimes you might want to do no, but you don't have the words. So you may be in an uncomfortable situation, or you may be actually being harmed. You can just, walk away, run away, get away from the situation without saying anything. You just get up and leave the conversation. You could walk out the door, get in your car, get some space, and then to try to make sense of what was going on that made you feel so uncomfortable or unsafe. And you don't owe anybody an explanation, as long as you're not leaving your small child at home.
Yes, of course.
Obviously, you can go in a separate room, right?
Yes.
Work on regulating yourself to figure out
yes.
what's going wrong. But I just needed some space, and it is best, right, with small children to say, "Mommy needs a break" or whatever.
I feel like
I'm gonna go in the other room.
Adults, we need timeouts all the time, and it's okay to take those.
Yes, and it's great to model those for kids so they don't feel like they're the only ones.
Yes.
But the last one, saying no. So if you have the words and you're able to say, I'm not comfortable talking about that, or any number of ways of saying no, and you can always lead with compassion and love and respect, and treat others with dignity when you are doing no. But it's a really important part of differentiating and having autonomy in your life.
Yeah, and I love that way. I just of you framing it and talking about it. And this is something I heard you talk about from that original podcast, and that I've referenced and been able to use in Sunstone presentations and even with clients, because I think it's very helpful to know that there might be some stages, and it takes a minute, and it's okay wherever you're at.
That's right. I'm so glad it's helpful.
Yes. Yeah. Now, kind of talking about these issues when it comes to maybe someone's having a faith crisis. Well, first of all, what does it look like if someone's having a faith crisis?
Yeah. So essentially, it looks like you asking questions about whether what you believe and what you've committed your life to is true for you or not. And although, this can be deeply anxiety provoking, ultimately determining the answer to your questions is a good thing, because despite the discomfort, it will ultimately lead you to determining what's true for you and to your authentic life.
Oh, yeah.
So it can be scary, and it involves a lot of unknowns, but ultimately it's a good thing, and it's a brave journey to go on, I think.
Oh, for sure. And I think as humans, it's normal and natural to want certainty and, want to have that. But life doesn't always work that way. And so, yeah, learning to kind of sit with our different feelings, and it's okay to have questions. I mean, I think this definitely applies to right now. Like, we don't have a lot of answers right now with the coronavirus. And that uncertainty is a lot of people are having a lot of anxiety with that.
Yeah, and it's a lot to hold. It's a lot to shoulder. And, some of us have been in or will be in a state of faith crisis for years, sometimes decades. And it really is and can be an acute mental health crisis. So I want to really encourage people to reach out for professional help, reach out to support groups, reach out to trusted family and friends who you think could help you through this difficult time, even if they don't understand or believe, if they're safe and they love you, and they can give you important help, I think. But particularly someone who is trained in how to help people who are going through a faith crisis or a transition. It's going to be, it could be life-saving. And I also just want to emphasize that, faith crises look different for everyone. So I can't answer definitively what it will look like, but you will know you're in one if you are questioning everything.
Yeah.
And fundamental life decisions, or things you once thought you knew were true, but now you're wondering if they are. And there's also this phenomenon called dissociation, which is essentially how we compartmentalize things psychologically when they become overwhelming. And there's, in the literature about this, there's a concept of a metaphorical shelf in our mind, and some people experience their shelf breaking and the contents of the shelf that have been compartmentalized about their faith questions come crashing down all at once. And this is, again, it can be very distressing, very disturbing to one's life and one's ability to function. And it can feel like a sudden lack of belief in the veracity of their religion. And then it can call into question everything. And, this really can impact relationships, especially if, everyone is in the religion, and all your support is in religion. So I really, really want to emphasize the importance of going slow.
Yeah.
And not making any decisions, quickly, that you have time, unless there's a life or death situation, then reach out, call 911, go to the hospital. But other than that, just take some deep breaths. And I'm going to provide some resources at the end that I hope will provide people support.
Yeah. So what are some things that you've learned since transitioning out of the church and in your work with people that are no longer practicing Mormonism?
So, just a few things. I mean, again, I don't want to impose my journey on anyone because everyone's journey looks different. So, I will just say that leaving the LDS church is not easy, particularly when you've been born and raised. And, and especially if someone really feels like Mormonism is part of their core identity, then it can be a lot to grapple with, but it is possible in time to be happy and feel grounded and to create new friendships and to find new communities that will support your individual growth and your family's values. And if you're considering leaving, I recommend preparing yourself. And this might sound a bit extreme, but I think it kind of is a generalization that may apply to most people. I think it's important to prepare yourself to lose the community at large. So, in most instances, it's nearly impossible, despite how much people in the ward and how much you might want to maintain the same kind of connectedness to the church community. But if you're not attending church every week, and this is not the fault of church members or church leaders, but because Mormonism is so high demand, it requires a lot of its members who are lay clergy and lay leaders to run the church from a local level without pay. They often have large families, and they're working in addition to raising their families, and they're volunteering many hours a week to keeping the congregation or the ward going. And so it's just really difficult for them to maintain the same level of contact with you when you're not showing up to church. And it's not because they maybe don't want to or aren't thinking of you. But it's just a matter of, living in time and space and having a limited number of time, and that they have so many needs of people right in front of them.
Definitely.
That they may be on your list, but they may not be reaching out. Or maybe you don't want them to reach out.
Yeah.
And then finally, because members have been conditioned to be wary of outsiders and their influence, this can make it difficult for even those, members of the church who want to stay in contact with you, who may feel conflicted about staying close to you or even having any contact with you once they know you've made a break from the church, because they may feel like they need to stay in full fellowship in the church, and they may often feel anxious or fearful about interacting with you because of the conditioning. So again, this is not anyone's fault. It's just what I've found to be kind of how it is. And I just want to prepare people.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And kind of what I'm hearing is, like in general, humans are just doing their best. And they're often busy and overworked and stressed, and not maybe a lot of training and trying to take on all these extra callings, and that it's not easy for anyone, and people don't always know how to react or say the right things, and we mess up, and that's part of being human. Yeah. So it's hard to maintain. I do think it's possible to maintain, friendships, but it definitely takes a lot of work, and it's good to kind of prepare people for different reactions.
Yeah. And I want to emphasize, it's possible to maintain individual friendships with people who are still attending church every week, and they still have the whole community full of activities, and you're feeling really lonely. But if you let individual people know that you feel safe with, that, hey, I'm feeling lonely, I really recommend, doing that and leading with vulnerability and letting your good friends know that, they would want to know that if you are feeling isolated, and you may just have to be the one at the beginning to keep the momentum up. And maybe even at certain times, if they're like got a new calling, or, and things change in people's lives so quickly week to week that, people just don't know what's going on in your life. If you're not at church, it's not their fault. And you don't know what's going on in their life. So you could have a weekly check-in with your good friends and almost kind of mimic a church, interaction. Like you could have a coffee date, or you could have a FaceTime check-in, or a text check-in. And I know it sometimes feels like it shouldn't be like the onus shouldn't be on, the less active or the former Mormon or the apostate Mormon, or whatever you want to, however you define yourself, which I leave it to people how they want to define. It's all good in my book, but it sometimes can feel like a bit of they should be fellowshipping me. And really that's part of the journey of leaving a group like this, is there's some self-pity involved, and some kind of like, woe is me, and like I'm the only one who's going through this. But again, I'm going to provide resources. There are communities out there, there are support groups, there are a lot of people who've gone through what you've gone through, and there are new friendships for you, there are new interests and hobbies, and there's a whole day, Sunday, that you're going to get to recreate. And at first it can feel very like a huge loss that you don't have that built-in structure, but then it can also feel really empowering that you get to decide what to do with that day. And it can be still a day of rest if that's what you need. Or it can be a day of, being in nature. And some people talk about, mountain church, they go to mountain church, or some people need to be in community. And so they find a new congregation that really speaks to them. And some people, religion is very triggering for them. And so if they have a group, it might be a book club that they start, or any myriad of things.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I love this idea of, I mean, at the beginning, it really can feel like a faith crisis, but it can turn into this beautiful faith transition, and you being able to empower yourself with these decisions, and even like what you're going to do on Sunday. I know that Thrive is a great resource for this.
Yes.
And they're getting just a lot of community support and even offering things on Sunday. So,
And for people not in Utah, since I'm not in Utah, I've heard
yes.
about Thrive, and I'm jealous that I can't. I'm envious of you Utahns. I'm not envious about much, but my Utah peeps, but I'm envious of that because it sounds phenomenal. But like I said, I'm going to offer some resources that no matter where you are in the world, you can get some support for people who know what you're going through.
And just a quick little plug for this. So this last week on Wednesday, when we normally have one of our Thrive groups meeting, I was leading it, and we did it through Zoom. And one of the cool things about that is we can connect with people from anywhere. So I do like that.
Great. Is that part of what you've done because of the Corona social isolation situation, or is that every week? Okay.
No, well, so every week it has been like Natasha doing it, but it was me and Jeff leading it this last week, and this was specific for the Holiday Thrive group. And we just decided, that we were going to make it Zoom because we felt like it would be easier for people to come, safer. I felt safer about it myself.
Yeah. So I might put in a plug for you guys to consider having an in-person group and a Zoom Thrive group.
Yeah,
because
I like that.
For people like me who, I'll never be able to come to an in-person one, might benefit, or other people who live outside of northern Utah.
Yes, I like that. Yeah, definitely. Now, when we're talking about this whole faith crisis and faith transitions, what unique challenges do Mormons face when they leave the church?
So that's a really good question, and I actually came prepared with a couple of quotes from some strong Mormon and Mormon adjacent women on this idea, because I figured you might ask me this, because there are a lot of specific things that we experience leaving this religion. So Margie DeLynn on a Mormon Stories podcast, it was called Faith Transition Part 1, she said, "Waking up can feel like a nightmare before it feels liberating."
I like that.
And Natasha Helfer Parker, on her Facebook page, she posted this last year on March 2nd, 2019. She said, "A faith transition from a high-demand religion invites an entire identity makeover."
Yeah.
So, this can feel very daunting to us Mormons who it really, has been part of our identity. It's been our whole world. So it can feel like you're waking up as a stranger in a strange land. And, some people feel very other, like whether they're around their Mormon family and friends, or whether they're with never Mormon people, that you almost can feel like an alien no matter where you are. And I know people experience this, leaving other groups. So it's in religion. So it's not necessarily unique to Mormons, but I think there's a way in which Mormons, the way we kind of have been, just conditioned socially and in our families, and just a lot of rhetoric around like, this is what we do. If you're a good person, you are a Mormon, and a Mormon believes and lives in this way. So I wanted to speak to a bit of some stages that people can often experience who are leaving a religion like the LDS Church. So the stages are, the first is you're going to evaluate your experiences. The second is you're going to need to adapt to a new normal. And then finally, you're going to be integrating over time into mainstream society. So briefly, I'm just going to go over some specifics about each stage. So evaluating your experiences. And again, if you're born and raised, this is like a lifetime. People who are converts, I think this process can actually be much maybe faster, depending, I guess, on how long they were practicing Mormonism. But the most essential thing to do right away is to get educated about what high demand religions look like, what their characteristics are, and kind of to understand like what you've been involved with and what's, kind of happened to you. And then I recommend finding a good therapist or a professional or a support group. And if you can't afford therapy, I understand it. So please reach out to the resources that are all free that I'm going to mention at the end of the podcast. Reading about, and about these groups and religions, and also just journaling about your experience can be really healing and helpful. And maybe most crucial of all is to find a support network that includes people who have transitioned out of the church, whether they're friends or extended family or family members that have been, dealing with this for some time. And one support system that I'm going to put a personal plug out there for is an Exponent 2, which is a community that's primarily a women's intersectional feminist space, but it does a gorgeous job of holding space for everyone on the Mormon spectrum. The Facebook group alone has thousands of members, and I don't know if it's like half and half, but it's got to be close to half and half practicing and not practicing Mormons, or, nuanced or progressive, like all across the spectrum. And there's just love and inclusivity there. But Exponent 2 is not just a private Facebook group, which you can join and request to join. They have a blog that they put out daily posts. They have a magazine that you can subscribe to. You can subscribe to it digitally or in paper. They have a retreat, an in-person retreat in New Hampshire once a year. And so I'm going to have other resources at the end, but evaluating your experiences and like starting your journey of getting your feet under you is going to be, but the very crucial part is having a support system. And then adapting to a new normal looks like tending to your personal health, discovering your personal strengths, which is, again, can be exciting, but sometimes daunting. It can seem like, I don't know what my strengths are. I was told before what I was good at in the church, and now I've left the church. But you get to figure that out one day at a time. Again, the emphasis here is on making decisions slowly and carefully, taking small incremental steps toward adjusting and healing. So there's no, to heal, we go slow. To go fast with healing from trauma like this is to go slow. So set small reachable goals. And I want to point out that some might experience a symptom called floating right after they leave the church, which can feel like you're floating through life untethered to the earth. And I think it's because you've lost, this centering, weekly ritual. Maybe you haven't been going to church every week, but you maybe have subscribed to these beliefs and values that, that maybe you didn't question before, but now you're questioning all of them. So you don't know what even your personal ethics or moral compass is. But again, you get to decide what that is for yourself. But this experience of floating is often temporary and is alleviated over time.
Well, I mean, if it's a whole belief system of like who we are and our identity, and then feeling like you lose that and rebuilding that, takes time.
Yeah. And so I don't want anyone to feel like, they're going crazy because they're feeling like they're floating. I mean, I wish I would have had this information when it was happening to me, because I mentioned to a never Mormon friend, like, I just feel like I'm floating. And she was like, but it's good, right? And I just felt like in that moment, again, I felt like an alien, like, well, maybe from your perspective, but it doesn't feel good. And I don't know that it's going to be good yet. I don't know how I'm going to recreate my life, from the ground up. So that's why it's so important to be able to talk to, people who were in your religion and who were in the church and who understood, especially people born and raised. I think if you were born and raised, that's going to be really helpful for you to feel like you're not crazy. And then thus integrating into mainstream society, again, it looks different for everybody. So I'm hesitant to say a lot about this, but maybe an example might be helpful, like in terms of how to navigate difference, and that this looks different for everybody. So, there might be a couple or a family who transitions out of the church at the same time, and maybe for some of the same reasons, but each of them are going to have their own unique journey, and they will adjust on their own timelines to being out of the church and in their own ways. So here's a little story. My 7-year-old daughter, well, she's 7 now. I can't remember how old she was at the time, but of this example I'm going to share. But in response to her hearing me tell a Mormon friend that, it's taking us some time to adjust to, our new lifestyle and even this new church, that we attend from time to time. And like immediately my young daughter piped up with, "Oh, it hasn't taken any time at all. It's been easy." And like, I was just struck in that moment with how different, it is we're in the same family. We transitioned out of the church at the same time, and we told our daughters our reasons and that we still love our, Mormon friends and family. In fact, this Mormon friend was a babysitter that still babysits for us frequently, and who's like managed our transition beautifully and just treats us, just like the same that she always has, and just loves us, and we love her. So you can see from this example that, someone who spent, like me, who spent 40 years plus in the church versus my young daughter who almost now doesn't remember attending the LDS church, we have very different reactions to this huge change. So again, just emphasizing that it's important to make space for your own journey and to like claim space that, if she were older, or if she were my spouse, I might say, well, that's great for you. I mean, I'm thrilled for you. There's been no skin off your nose. But for me, it's been, I've been through some stuff and I've had some feelings.
Yeah.
So
it's okay for it to look different. And it's amazing how resilient children are.
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought up that idea of resilience, because it's so important to remember that human beings are resilient. And although there's no magic bullet or quick fix, just with time and patience and with a lot of self-care, that, you can over time have the self-confidence and the strength and create, everything that you want for yourself and, for your family on this journey.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I love how you brought it up, like kind of those different different steps or things that people go through. And I definitely want to normalize, like we're social beings, and we need support, and we need connection. And so that is one of the things I think that is important to find. And also, it's great. I really like to empower people. And so some people, it might be right for them, the high demand religion, or, being in Mormonism might be a beautiful thing for them. But that doesn't mean that it's that way for everyone. So it's a very individual thing.
Right. And you can have a mixed faith marriage where, two people feel very differently, but their love sustains them and they can stay married for a lifetime. And then there's some couples who struggle to navigate that, and the marriage may dissolve. And there may be a time where people separate, but they may get back together. Or, often it can look like one spouse leaves and then they are in a mixed faith marriage for a long time, and then eventually the other one leaves. Sometimes one spouse will leave and then come back.
Yes, that's true.
So that happens a lot in high demand religions, that people leave and then they can come back. And we could do a future podcast on all of these stages. There's actually a lot more stages in between. I mentioned the self-pity stage, and there's acceptance, and then there can be like going back. But we could, if there's interest, we could do a couple more podcasts about more on this theme of navigating a faith transition.
Yeah, I would love to do that, because I do think it's very needed. especially with how complex and how it can look different for so many people. There's so many different issues for us to address. So, yes.
Great. Well, I'm down. Whenever.
Nice. And we've already talked a little bit about boundaries, but what advice would you give those, like, in particular, of those that are thinking of leaving the church, instead of how they can set those healthy boundaries?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm going to say embrace your no. Again, that's what boundaries are all about. Is no is a complete sentence. You don't owe anyone an explanation for any no that you give. That you need consent to get a calling in your ward. You can opt in and out of church activities. And as a non-practicing Mormon, sometimes to support a friend, or if it's like a secular activity, our family has chosen to go to a church activity, and often we'll go to, birthday parties or other social gatherings of dear friends who are still practicing Mormons, and we're embraced, and we embrace everyone there, and most people there are ward members. So you can also opt in even if you've left. And you can go to church with a family member, or you can, there are lots of ways that this can look, but I think it's really important for people to feel like they can say no, and also that you don't owe anybody an explanation for why you are saying no, or behaving differently, or not attending church, or why you have decided to step away from the church. And this can be really difficult, and there can be a lot of tension, especially with close family members or even some church leaders that feel entitled to your story or to your private information. But these no's can look like not answering them at all if they're demanding a meeting, or they're emailing you or texting you incessantly and saying they deserve to know, or you must tell them. You can not answer them. You can take your time and decide what you want to say, if anything. And you can use text or email instead of talking in person. Or if you do decide the relationship is important enough to you that, and their incessant requests for, contact with you is creating more distress for you than to not have contact with them, you could bring someone with you who could act as a safe buffer. So ultimately, the idea around boundaries is that no one's entitled to your presence at their church meeting or their activity, or any family gatherings that feel hostile or unsafe, that it's just your private business, why you're doing what you're doing. So, this can also be tricky when you run into people, but
definitely
from the ward too. So you can behave however you feel comfortable in those situations too.
No, I love this idea of, like, giving ourselves permission to say no, and that's okay. And I think, especially as a woman, like, I just have always, like, oh, be polite, be nice, like, say yes. We're even told, don't say no to anyone that asks you to dance. And it's like we were never taught consent, or, that we have that right to say no. So I think that's so important.
Yeah. And consent, you took the word right out of my mouth. I was thinking that it's not part of our Mormon parlance. So it's like, if you find yourself surprised in your neighborhood or at your workplace by a ward member, they may not know what to do, you may not know what to do, but if you don't want to talk to them, you don't have to, right? That's embracing your no, that's doing no. You don't have to explain to anyone how you know this person. And you can do no by leaving the room, or you can also just talk to them about other things that don't have to do with the church. If you don't mind speaking to them and they're, a safe enough person and you're friendly, then, what I've really appreciated is people, when I've run into them in my neighborhood in Manhattan, people in the ward who have just put me at ease by talking about something that we have in common that's outside the church. Like, You know, it can even be the weather, or it can be, how are your kids doing? Or, you know, have you been to that new playground? Or the coronavirus is a great thing that we're all going through, or an election, or, you know, talking about things that are neutral, or which the election is probably not, but
Yeah.
but just trying, you know, I really appreciate that. And if it's somebody, again, that's unsafe, please do not feel obligated.
Definitely.
Oh, and I wanted to mention that interacting with family with boundaries, right? So we started out talking about enmeshed families. And then if you are in a meshed family and you're in a high demand religion and you decide to differentiate in a way that you know is not going to be accepted by your family, that, you know, this how and when you interact with them should be determined on a case-by-case basis. Again, there's no prescription for how to differentiate, you know, in this way. So just depending on the family member and how much they honor your autonomy and your boundaries, I would use that as your guide for who you want to take with you on this journey and share and include in your support group as you navigate the transition. Because, you know, there will be time to heal, hopefully, family relationships over time. As long as there's not, you know, severe abuse or untreated mental illness that makes it, you know, so you have a hard time functioning or living your life if you're in contact with them, you know, barring those kinds of extreme examples, or someone who's a criminal or who's a pedophile, you know, I mean, there are those cases even in Mormonism. So I don't want to, you know, exclude that. That's real, and that causes people a lot of pain. But outside of that, although it can be challenging and messy, and we all make mistakes on a journey of a faith transition, especially with people who are close to us, that hopefully we can offer each other a lot of grace, and we can go back if we feel like we really made a mistake or really may have said something insensitive or unkind, or, you know, out of anger or pain, that we can go back and say, hey, I've been thinking about what happened and what I said, and, you know, and apologize and let the person know how much they mean to you, and that you would really like to try to work through these differences and, you know, agree to disagree about the church, but to find ways that you can stay connected as family members or close friends despite your transition.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. And yes, life really is messy. It really is. So
Agreed.
Yeah. Now, we do often have a lot of LDS leaders that do listen to our podcasts, and so they might be listening to this. So this gives you a little bit of a platform, like if you have any advice that you would give them, and just how to deal with this, because a lot of bishops don't have a lot of training, and they're doing their best, and they're, you know, good people. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but, you know, there's exceptions. But in general,
Right.
Yeah, what advice do you give them?
Yeah, so I really recommend that church leaders, no matter the capacity that you, in the role that you are playing, you know, in the church at any given time, if someone's going through a faith crisis or telling you that they're in the process of, you know, leaving the church, to really have as your focus leading with love and compassion in your interactions with them. This is, again, this kind of a life transition can create an acute mental health crisis. It can create physical health symptoms and challenges. It can disrupt people's, you know, family relationships, their marriages. It can cause strain with their children. It can, if they're single, it can be very isolating and can create a lot of challenges. And so, you know, church leaders have a lot of power, and they can, for good or ill, right? Like all of us who have positions of authority. So I would just really hope that they would work to honor members' boundaries and autonomy, and really think about these ideas of enmeshment and healthy differentiation, and to, you know, accept people's no's
Yes.
callings or how much contact they want to have with you or with, ward members or ward leaders. And, the biggest thing is just, I think, as a lay religious leader, I think it behooves you to educate yourself about the stages of faith and faith crises and faith transitions and what they entail, so that you can truly have compassion for the suffering that's involved in the journey. And, I think something I, wasn't prepared to say, but I think is important is to say to leaders who maybe have no context for this or can't fathom why the person would want to leave the church, is to say that I don't think anyone ever plans on leaving, a group that they were born and raised in, or a religion, or that they were born and raised in, or and then risking family relationships, sometimes their employment if they work for a church affiliated business. This isn't something people often choose, because they just want to, live the fast life, or,
Yes.
there are a lot of stereotypes and projections.
We're even given this narrative about why people leave, and sometimes instead of really connecting with another person, we just assume all those things. Oh, they're lazy. Oh, they just want to drink. And it's so much more complex than that.
Right. And if leaders are curious, then, and if the member is open to having a dialogue, I think, if you're interested in asking why, I think that could be helpful to dispel some of those myths, to find out, to sit down with people who, not to coerce them, and obviously with their consent, but if it's truly in the spirit of understanding and love and wanting to keep a connection or a friendship. And if you truly love someone, your relationship with them isn't dependent on whether or not they show up to church or espouse the same beliefs as you. So I would hope that leaders would, to think about how the Jesus of the New Testament might behave towards someone who's other, or choosing, or looks different, or seems different, or is acting different, and to not prejudge, why or why they're doing it, what they're doing or their behaviors, and to not accuse them of things that aren't true. I've heard stories about that people can sometimes, our imaginations can take over. So, facts and education and information from the right sources is paramount.
Definitely. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I love how you said, leading with love. Love one another. This commandment we've been given really is so important. And really letting that guide, I think. And I love, I'm going to quote my friend Kimberly Anderson, who says, "Love first, understand later."
That's lovely.
Isn't it? Yeah, so simple but profound. And if we could really love like that, it just is beautiful.
So true.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that I haven't asked that you wanted to share?
Yes. So those resources I keep promising, I want to provide those now. And then I have a little poem that I hope will bring people comfort. So to wrap up. So again, the exponent 2, and exponent it's the number 2, or the Roman numeral 2, because it's the second iteration of a Mormon women's publication that it was from our early church history. There was the women's exponent that early Mormon women started. It was a newspaper, I believe. And then in the 1970s, a group of women in Boston decided to create a second iteration. And there's a blog, so you can go to exponent2.com for the blog. And there's also a link there to the main group page that has a link to the magazine and the information about the retreat, and the Facebook page. And again, we'll provide links at the end of the podcast for that. Second, if you're on Instagram, Parenting After Mormonism, and it's parenting.aftermormonism is a useful resource for those with children. There is a podcast and a Facebook group called Wardless. That's WARDLESS. That if you start at the beginning, it has like a handful of people in the Seattle area, Mormon affiliated people. The host himself is a practicing Mormon. I think his wife, who's part of the interviewees, has left the church, but people all across the spectrum, and understanding like how they're navigating their transition. It's really great. And you can request to be involved in their private Facebook group. Thoughtful Transitions is kind of under the Mormon Stories umbrella. That's a private Facebook group you can also request to be part of, which has a more jovial side, but they also try to provide real emotional support to people. Mormon Spectrum has a website where you can connect to people, again, who are on the outside of practicing Mormonism, but really want to stay in contact with former members. And you can, it's for in-person meetups all around the world. Mormon Stories podcast community, also on Facebook. I think I covered all of them that come to mind. Oh no, finally, Sunstone. That's the last one. Yeah, you mentioned, I think you mentioned, or maybe just in our pre-conversation, you mentioned that you really like Lindsay Hansen Park's definition of kind of there are many ways to be a Mormon, and that's the Sunstone slogan, and that we're all allowed to claim Mormonism no matter our level of belief or activity in the church. And I concur wholeheartedly. So Sunstone has a publication, I think it's a journal. They have a podcast, and they also have an annual conference for anyone who doesn't know, in Salt Lake City. It's every summer. I don't know if it will be happening this year with coronavirus or not, but I often show up there. And yeah, so those are the resources. Did I get all the ones?
Yeah, those are some great ones and some new ones to me. So definitely appreciate that. Yeah, and I normally speak at Sunstone, so we'll see if we have it this year. But that's been, I think, one of the wonderful resources. So yeah.
So do we have time for this little poem?
Oh, we definitely do. Yes.
Okay. So here is a poem that was written by Jan Richardson, and it's called "And the Table Will Be Wide." And it really speaks to me, and I think it's comforting. I hope it provides comfort to any of you who are on a faith transition journey. And the table will be wide, and the welcome will be wide, and the arms will open wide to gather us in, and our hearts will open wide to receive, and we will come as children who trust there is enough. And we will come unhindered and free, and our aching will be met with bread, and our sorrow will be met with wine. And we will open our hands to the feast without shame, and we'll turn toward each other without fear. And we will give up our appetite for despair, and we will taste and know of delight. And we will become bread for a hungering world, and we will become drink for those who thirst. And the blessed will become the blessing, and everywhere will be the feast.
Thank you. That's powerful.
Yeah, I had chills when I was speaking it. I hadn't read it out loud before, but it was shared with me by a trusted post-Mormon who's actually a pastor now in the Community of Christ, Nancy Ross, and I wanted to share it with our listeners today.
Oh, wow.
For anyone who's feeling any amount of despair, or isolation, or grief, I think this is meant to be like a prayer for something like World Communion Day or something like that. I'm not a pastor, so I don't know the right language or the reason for why it's often used, but it really speaks to me. I hope it speaks for some of our listeners as well.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it will. definitely speaks to me. Yeah, thank you. Well, how can people find you if they kind of have questions or want to connect or?
Sure. So I have a website, wendychristiantherapy.com, and my last name is spelled like the religion. You can remember it. Like, Mormons are Christians after all. Yes, Wendy Christian is a Mormon and a therapist. But I don't offer Christian therapy or, religious therapy, but that just happens to be my name. And so there's an email form on my website that you can reach out to me on. And I have a profile on Psychology Today. Also, if you type my name and find a therapist, you'll find me there as well.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Wendy, for joining me today. I appreciate your time and you sharing your experiences and your expertise. And I definitely want to have you back to discuss other topics, including, I kind of think that there's some other related topics that we can kind of build off of this to be a little bit of a series. So
I'm game. That sounds great. Be happy to.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today at Mormon Mental Health.
Thanks so much, Jen.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by The Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll. Hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot twixt me and the peaceful rest. Then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,